In this clip you will learn how to convert values in a data binding with an I-value converter. Let's switch to Visual Studio. In the previous clip, you implemented the smooth navigation method in the customer's view model. But this code here is impossible to read if you don't look at the grid column definitions in the user interface. So what is 2 and what is 0? Instead of using these magic numbers here, let's introduce an enumeration. So here, let's create an enum and let's call it navigation site. Let's define the values left and right. Now let's scroll up to the navigation column property and let's change here the type from int to navigation site. I also rename this property from navigation column to navigation site. Let's press Ctrl- to rename this property. Now let's scroll up to the navigation column field at the top of the class. Let's change here the type from int to navigation site and let's call this field also navigation site. I press Ctrl- to rename it. Now let's scroll down again to the move navigation method. Here you can't set that property anymore to these magic numbers. Instead of doing this, let's check here if the property has the value left, and if that's the case, let's set here the value to right, and if the value was right, let's set it to left. Now you can read this code without any knowledge about the grid column definitions in the user interface. Now let's go to the Solution Explorer and let's open the Customer's View SAML file where we bind to the navigation column property. You renamed this property to navigation site. Now let's run the application and let's see what happens. Let's click on the button and of course nothing happens anymore. When you open in Visual Studio the SAML binding failures window, you can see here an error for the grid column property. It says cannot create default converter to perform conversions between navigation site and int32. Consider using converter property of binding. So you need to convert that enumeration to an integer value for this grid column property. To do this, you can use the converter property of the data binding. So you need actually a converter that you can assign to this property. And that converter has to implement the I-value converter interface. So let's go to the Solution Explorer, let's right-click our project, and let's add here a new folder that I call Converter. Now let's right-click this folder and let's select from the context menu Add Class. Let's call the class Navigation Site to Grid Column Converter and let's add it to the project. First, I make this class a public class and let me also remove the unnecessary usings. Now on this class, let's implement the I-value converter interface. I press Ctrl- to add a using directive for system Windows data. Let's press Ctrl- again to implement this interface. As you can see, it has two methods, convert and convert back. The convert back method is only needed when you use this converter in a two-way data binding. As we have only a one-way data binding, you only have to implement the convert method. Here you can see the first parameter is the value. So you can actually create here a navigation site variable and then let's use the navigation site enumeration. I press Escape to close IntelliSense and Ctrl- to add a using directive for the view model namespace. And now you just cast the incoming value into that enumeration. Now from this method, you have to return the int value for the grid column property. So let's add here a return statement. And now let's say if the navigation site is left, then we should use grid column 0 as this is the column for the left side, and else you should use grid column 2 as this is the one for the right side. So let's also add here a little comment and let's write here value for grid column. Now this converter is done. Beside the value parameter, it has also a few other parameters. It has here the target type, which will be in this case int, as the grid column property is of type int. Then there is also an object parameter and the culture, and these values can be passed by using this converter parameter property and converter culture property of the data binding. But we don't need these, we just need to use the converter property. Now the question is how to set it. To use the converter, you need to define it as a resource. To do this, you use on the user control the resources property element, and then you use here the navigation side to grid column converter. I press Ctrl dot to add an XML namespace for that .NET converter namespace that we created. Now you also need to give this converter a key by using the xKey attribute. Usually for converters, I just use the class name as a key. So let's paste in here that key, and maybe let's make it a bit shorter. Let's call it just conf. Now let's scroll down to the data binding, and here you can set now this converter property by using the static resource markup extension. As you can see, this sees already here the key that we have defined for the converter. So let's insert that key, and now let's run the application again. The application comes up, and now you can click on the Move button, and you can see the navigation is moved again. When you go to the converter, you can actually add a breakpoint here in the convert method. Now let me bring up the application again. Let's click here on the button, and you can see the convert method is called with the value right. So here we get the value right, and for that one the 2 is returned from this method, and so the navigation is moved to the right side. Alright, now you learned how to convert values in a data binding with an I-value converter. Now let's wrap up what you have learned in this module.